teach Almaas, is a spiritual teacher and an author and the founder of Diamond Approach to Self-Realization. Kabir Helminksi, hi Kabir, is the author and the co-founder of the Threshold Society and Baraka Institute, and he is also a translator of Rumi, of the works of Rumi, and also a sheikh of the Evlevi order.
Perfect.
And Robert Sapolsky, he's a science and nature writer, biologist and neuroscientist, and professor of neurobiology, fair enough, yes, Stanford University. And he has been working with the Institute of Primates Research at the National Museum of Kenya. Thank you. And what a wonderful, one of the dreams of Zen is to always bring different perspectives when we explore a topic. And today we have an opportunity to bring the perspective of biologists and neuroscientists, of a Sufi mystic and a spiritual mystic, Hamid, who brings also the perspective of Western psychology and Western mysticism. So I will begin with the obvious question, which is, what is it to be a human being? What is your perspective, and what does it mean to you, and how has your view of being human evolved over the years as your work has progressed? If you could reflect on that, and maybe we can start with you, Robert.
Well, one example of the shift is I started studying my baboons in East Africa when I was 20, and went back there every summer for 33 years or so. And my focus has always been on health and stress. And the original thing I was looking at there was, why are some baboons healthier than others? What does it have to do with stress? What does it have to do with social stress? Baboons are wonderful models for that, for westernized humans. They're rotten, violent, competitive, awful animals, and they treat each other miserably. So they're wonderful models. And when I went out there as a 20-year-old, what I thought I was going to be studying was how, if you have a choice in the matter, you want to be a high-ranking baboon, not a low-ranking one, in terms of blood pressure, cholesterol levels, cardiovascular function, all the various things I've studied in them. And it took me about 15 years to figure out that I had wasted about 15 years out there by asking the completely wrong question. And I think that one was much more reflective of my needing to no longer be a 20-year-old male, in that realizing that if you have a choice in the matter, you would much rather be a socially affiliated baboon than a high-ranking one, that was much more of a predictor of health. And you could be the highest ranking baboon in the savannah, and if you were a neurotic type A impossible individual, you were going to have as lousy of health as the lowest ranking individual there. Social affiliation, social support, symmetrical, stable friendships, which is a real word to use in other species. And I think what that mostly has done is make me perceive humans of necessity as more social creatures than I may have before then, when I was spending most of my time around baboons. But that definitely required some seasoning past age 20.
Thank you. And feel free to reflect also on each other's perspectives, and be curious and ask questions. So,
sure. I'll continue a little
yes.
bit. I want to say that baboon psychology, I think, is an essential part of Sufi psychology too. And I learned a lot from your presentation. And that what the human being is at a certain level is we are animals. And we have these behaviors. and we need to understand them. And we also, as you said, to understand that that there is a value, not just a survival value, but there is a innate human value in relationships, and that. So spirituality for me, which is for me the heart of reality, the heart of this life, and what it means to be human. Spirituality is something about understanding the human being in a context of a greater reality. That greater reality, the macrocosm, actually is not merely a universal material, but is a tender universe, if I may put it that way. That the qualities of compassion, of generosity, of mystery, of longing, are actually attributes of this whole reality, and they reflect within this organism, this animal organism, because these are in the very nature of the universe, and that we cannot adequately understand the human being unless we understand the human being in the context of this greater reality. And so it's like a seed. If you were to see a seed all by itself, you wouldn't really know very much about it until you could consider soil, moisture, sunlight, and the destiny of what the seed is meant to be in terms of the wholeness of its proper environment. And for me, our environment is cosmic, not merely earthly, and that in one sense, to get sort of to the point and make it really, really simple, that if there is a purpose to human life, and I can allow that there are many, many sub-purposes, but perhaps the highest purpose of human life is to understand, experience, perceive the generosity, beauty, and intelligence of reality. Generosity, beauty, and intelligence of reality. And for me, maybe I'm an atheist too, but I believe in reality. I believe in the real, and I believe that the real is not limited to physicality or materiality, that it includes this dimension of a qualitative dimension which the human experiences through the heart. So to restate it one more time, to know, but in theistic terms, understanding that this is still within the non-dual unitive realm, that we are here to know the generosity and beauty of God.
Thank you. Yeah.
You know, as Dr. Podolsky was in his talk was showing, is that the animal kingdom, there's a spectrum, which of course has to do with the evolution of life from one form to another. And that shows that the human being is sort of as part of that spectrum, towards sort of the later end of the spectrum. And the more evolution, the more complexity and the more capacity and the more different thing until we become more social and other things. And I think part of this evolution that is obvious that, you know, biologists and evolutionists discuss is that the human being is, as a result of this evolution, we developed a cerebral cortex and a bigger brain, and we're able to do things that the other primate couldn't do, right? Socially and thought-wise, reflection, telling stories, and all of that. The invention of mathematics, the complexity of mathematics, developing science, all of that. And all of that is part of being human, that we are, so far, it looks like we are at the end of the spectrum. We don't know. I don't know for sure we are at the end of the spectrum, or that there will be more evolution, or maybe there are already some beings who are more evolved than us. But as far as we know, we evolve in terms that we have our range of experience and capacity, and what we could do has expanded and continues to expand. But the other part of the human, about the evolution, that the theory of evolution doesn't show, is that by the time we become humans, humans are able to reflect on their experience. We can be self-reflective, think of our experience, tell stories about our experience, and reflect on it in the sense of know it, feel it, know it, and make theories about it, conclusions, insight about it. I don't know of any other primates can do that. But that is the beginning of what we call consciousness. Now, all beings, all life has consciousness, but the consciousness of a human being has also more capacity than the physical body has. The physical body, human being, does all kinds of things, the brain of a human being. But the consciousness of a human being has capacities that I don't know if any of the other biological creatures has, which is that it can know itself. It can know itself, and by knowing itself, it can become what the human being can become, what the Sufis call the human being is a barzakh. Barzakh is an Arabic word which means a bridge or a connector between the physical, the visible world, and the invisible world. And the human being is a bridge, and that's consciousness that can be aware of itself, reflect on itself, and can create all kinds of stuff from within itself, is really the beginning, but it is the bridge that connects the physical to the non-physical. Now, science doesn't study the non-physical, that is not its domain. It never, hypothesized that its domain. I mean, psychology does some of that, but in the spiritual dimension, which I'm interested in, and Kabir is, and many people here, is that recognizing that we are a consciousness that can know itself as a consciousness is a beginning of an entry into a whole other universe, which is as vast as the physical universe, that most people don't know of, and it's not easy to know of it. It is invisible, and you need to develop the consciousness that we have as a human being need to sort of be clarified and need to mature for it to open up to this other dimensions of reality of being, where really the sense of where it comes from it, the sense of fulfillment, satisfaction, contentment, intimacy, values, and the sense of selflessly loving another person and giving to them and sacrificing oneself even for the other. And all what humanity called the virtues, or what they call the true human values, they come from a dimension that has nothing to do with our physicality. That's what spiritual people know. It is not done through scientific experiment, but through personal experience. You find a place within us that is really the source of the values, because the values are experience. When you actually, even value itself is experience. Love itself is experience as a kind of presence. Intimacy itself is experience, not as an intimacy with a person, but something in its own. Spaciousness, expansion is experience in its own as spaciousness, as expansion. Mystery, people call mystery, and if this is mystery, you can experience a state of mystery, in the sense that mystery is not something in mysterious, I haven't known. No, mystery is the nature of a certain state. It is inherently mystery in meaning, you know it as mystery. When you know it as mystery, you know it, because there is nothing more to know about it. It is mystery, and it is a wonder, and it's a beauty. And so the human being is the being that has evolved to develop a consciousness that not only self-reflective, but a consciousness that can open up to the inner side of the universe, not in terms of atoms and all of that, but another dimension that spiritual people has paid attention to all throughout the years. So the human is the bridge that connects the two. We are physical, and it's important that we are physical, we stay healthy and all of that, in fact, and be as sensitive in our bodies, and to acknowledge and take care of our physicality, but at the same time, the physical is one side, the inner side is a consciousness, what we call inner subjectivity, is the beginning of a consciousness that we can experience palpably as something that is not just aware of something else, but aware of itself and aware of itself as something that is not physical, that is obviously. And the people who know it, they say awakened, they know for certainty, and nobody can convince them otherwise that it really is what it is. And the corroboration is that many other people have that experience, and across many traditions, many cultures.
Yeah. Wow. Well, one of our dreams at Sen is when you bring scientists who are really, in science, there is no place for personal experience, right? There is only independent observation. And then we have spiritual teachers where it's only about personal experience. So I'm always curious, in this exploration, can we ever reach to the same place? Or once we venture into those explorations, do we find similarities? And maybe, Robert, I love your new book, Behave, where from biological perspective, you're the scientist that brings so many different perspectives together. When you speak about human behavior and you ask the question, what happens 1 second before we take an action? And you go back to millions of years ago and you look at what happens to our hormones and our neurons and what happened in our childhood. So you do bridge that long chain of evolution to this moment. In your work, is there place for a universal experience, or have you ever touched on unconditioned experience or mystical experience, if you want to call it? How do you relate to that?
Unfortunately, as I sit here thinking about how I'm about to start flailing desperately.
No, there's no place.
I am very much a materialist. I'm a dead white male scientist. I think there is nothing explainable out there that is not in the context of the physical laws of the universe. At the same time, what's clear is there's absolutely no reason to think that we know all of the physical laws of the universe at present. And the ones that we know now and take for granted were sheer magic a century ago or 10 years ago or such. And it would be absolute arrogance to assume that we know everything now that we need to. Within that framework, I have absolutely every bit of confidence that all aspects of human experience are explicable in a scientific framework. Nonetheless, that's not the same thing as a reductive framework, because there's emergent stuff that happens with complex systems like all those molecules that make up one of your cells, or all those cells that make up your organs, or individuals who make up a society. And at the same time, I'm absolutely confident that we haven't a clue of what most of the interesting things are yet. So to make any stance based on having a whole lot of respect for the current state of knowledge is a little bit shaky, I think.
I'd like to actually ask you a question. Robert, is your name? Yes. I was touched by an example, I think, of those baboons who, when they saw an injustice done to another, would go and groom the one that had experienced the injustice. And this seems to be an indication of something quite extraordinary, something human-like going on with these primates. And from my point of view, or my understanding, there's no reason why some of the spiritual attributes of the human being might not exist to some extent in other creatures. Even if I think the human being occupies an extraordinary position just within nature, nevertheless, in my spiritual cosmology, why should not other levels and species be imbued with some of the divine qualities, what I'm calling divine qualities? And this is one, the fact that of wanting to comfort what's going on. Why should they care? Now, to me, the cheap explanation would be somehow it supports evolution. Frankly, I would argue with that, although I would be willing to listen to such an argument. But personally, I think explaining everything in terms of evolution is just another scientific dogma that I wish science would get over. I think there's so much more going on. So I'd like to hear from you, Robert. What do you think is going on in that case when there's obviously a perception of justice, injustice, fairness, empathy, brotherhood, shall we say? These are internal experiences, and I think that I'll also remark that for human beings, our most precious experiences, what is most precious in human life is at least 99% inner and invisible. Even though sometimes that inner experience may be reflected in nature, in a flower, even in a pet, but the inner experience of caring about, and even when the caring doesn't enhance my survival, in fact, may be in contradiction to survival value for me personally, that fellow feeling, that love may cause us to take, irrational actions, not in our self-interest at all. This is interesting. So what might be going on there from a scientist's point of view?
Well, I think, just as a jumping off point, say your point about the extent to which our lives are internal lives, the neurobiology absolutely supports that. I mean, one wonderful example of this, so in the back of your head sits your primary visual cortex, and those are your layers of neurons that turn vision into first pixels and then lines and then three-dimensionality, and then you figure out what it is you're looking at. And it's very easy to think of that part of the brain that what it does is get information from your eyes, and then it passes its decoding onto the rest of the brain. The remarkable thing is 80% of the inputs into the visual cortex, and it's the same thing with auditory cortex, all these, 80% of the inputs are coming from the brain itself, not from the outside sensory world. In other words, 80% of what those neurons are hearing about is perception rather than sensation, subjectivity, interpretation, filters by experience, by emotion, even at the level of your neurons whose job it is to say there's a dot on this photoreceptor, a dot of light, and not that photoreceptor, or already awash in most of what they're hearing about is what your brain has to say about that. Meaning that the neurobiology of our internal lives are enormous. In terms of making sense of things like empathy in other species, you can spend an entire career debating with people whether there's any such thing as empathy and altruism in humans. And sort of the whole cynical stance is, scratch an altruist and a hypocrite bleeds, that there's always self-interest, there's always internalized reward there. But the second you get chimps going out of their way to groom someone who's had a lousy day due to no fault of their own, you've ruled out all of these supposed internal bits of hypocrisy that motivate our supposed best moments. And that's a very powerful continuum for me. What is striking, though, is other aspects of the continuum. For example, lab rats, as I mentioned, will press levers to release another rat from a cage that it's distressed in. Okay, that's pretty spectacular. Immediate cynical interpretation is it's not because it's doing anything empathic, but the damn rat in that other cage is giving these distressing ultrasonic vocalizations that are really getting on my nerves. Will somebody let this guy out already? That it's self-interest in that sense. Okay, how can you show that that's not the case? Because that's not what the motivation is for the rat, because the rat shows this terribly familiar human quality, which is it doesn't do it for just any old rat. It's got to be either a rat it knows, a cage mate, or a rat that is genetically of the same strain as itself, a rat who smells like a me instead of a them. So showing that element of self-interest or that element of parochialism. What's interesting in terms of another familiar feature of it is you then look at who it is that a rat is capable of looking away from and ignoring their distress in that cage. And this is some work that my lab did, which if you throw in a drug which blocks a stress response in that rat, its realm of empathy expands. It's suddenly willing to work to release a rat that it doesn't know, or a rat that it doesn't like. And then, remarkably enough, we actually got permission to throw the same drug in some college freshmen and showed a similar sort of thing. What's that telling us? All the ways in which empathy, which in theory should be this wondrously boundless sort of thing, it's instead bounded by fear and bounded by stress and bounded by parochialism and bounded by a limited imagination, even for a rat, as to what kind of rat counts as an us as opposed to a rat them. And in that regard, it's absolutely familiar.
Yeah, I wonder about other things. Like I remember reading or hearing of a primate, that primates are capable of the sense of awe and wonder. Is it true?
Again, subjectivity. My baboons are not capable of awe, as far as I can tell. They're mostly capable of conniving. Why they're so wonderful to study. The baboons I study live in the Serengeti in East Africa, which is the greatest place on earth to be a baboon. You only have to work about 3 hours a day for your calories. You live in these big organized troops, so the lions and leopards don't mess with you much. A baboon infant has a better chance of reaching a first birthday than the neighboring Maasai humans do in terms of immortality. So there's this amazing implication, which is if you only have to spend 3 hours a day getting your calories, you have 9 hours of free time every day to devote to making some other baboon miserable. All they do is generate social stress and machinations. If you're a baboon and you're unhappy, it's because another baboon has worked very hard to bring that state about. They're amazing models for westernized stress. So in that regard, I don't see a whole lot of that in the baboons. Apes, though, chimps, gorillas, Goodall and others, Goodall reporting, for example, once a chimp walking back with a handful of roots and tubers that it had dug up to eat and comes around a bend in the path and sees a sunset and stops there and drops what it's holding. You can have a gazillion different interpretations as to what's going on with that, ranging to it just triggered a migraine headache in the poor chimp who had to drop the food. But at least the most parsimonious thing is there's something mighty familiar there with that. That sure looks like awe.
Yeah.
So I think the closest primate relatives we have, the other apes, I think we're not alone in that regard.
And how is it explained in terms of neuroscience? Something like awe or wonder like that. Is there any, like empathy, there's mirror neurons, for instance, that explains empathy. But something like awe and wonder, how do the neuroscientists explain it? Is there an explanation so far?
The standard argument there is immediately people, and I agree, Kabir, with your gut feeling that falling to it must have an evolutionarily adaptive purpose is way too much of an easy out that ultimately doesn't say a whole lot. The other school of thought is by the time you look at awe and aesthetics and spirituality and belief, it's, in the words of Steven Pinker, frosting on top of our cognitive cake. In the sense of you can't throw that many neurons together into a brain without coming out the other end of it all sorts of stuff like that. With enough quantity, you invent quality. You invent subjectivity, you invent aesthetics, things of that sort. And in a lot of ways that makes a ton of sense to me, simply because you take one of our neurons and you take a fruit fly neuron and you put them under a microscope and you can't tell which one is which. They look the same, they use the same chemicals, they have the same molecules, they smell the same, they taste the same, and the sole difference is we have 100 million of them for every one that a fruit fly has. And you throw enough of them together and out comes non-linear, non-additive, emergent stuff out the other end, which is just an end in and of itself. That's, I think, the closest thing to sort of scientific hand-waving that one could come up with as to what awe is and all the related things to that.
So we can see operating in nature that these emergent phenomena that arise out of sufficient complexity. So it's remarkable evidence that there is a mechanism here, that these experiences are not necessarily just ethereal, totally non-physical experiences, that at least they rely to some extent on physical neurons and other structures. And just as even in human societies, you may also have emergent phenomena, things that come with a certain quantity and complexity, something new and unexpected arises. The question still remains is, how can I verbalize this? But within this universe, just take something like the appreciation of beauty. What's that? Why does beauty matter? And why does it matter so much to human beings? And there are many kinds of beauties. I don't just mean physical or aesthetic beauty, but all the forms of beauty which in some ways prevail over so many other instincts. Although admittedly, within the population of human beings, there will inevitably be people who will be drawn to cruder, more base, shall we say, attractions. But then we also recognize in ourselves and in each other that there is a kind of hierarchy of quality. At least we feel it, between people who are living for some sense of beauty, who serve beauty, who serve an ideal, and don't just serve themselves or serve the interests of their own, subgroup. So we see emerging these qualities of love of beauty and, even love of something that is beyond and far beyond individual selfishness. So these possibilities are built into this reality that we're in. I find that interesting.
Me too. And in the process, it throws most of the easy models that science provides about behavior, it throws them out the window. If you're interested in altruism, cooperation, all of that, you can spend forever studying models of reciprocity and optimizing your strategy and all of that. And that's central to thinking about the evolution of cooperation. And then what do? You're in a foreign city and you're at the airport and you're about to leave and you're never going to set foot in this place again. And as you enter the terminal, you do something that undoes every bit of theorizing about the evolution of cooperation. You pause for a second and you hold the door open for someone who you are never going to see again, who is never going to be in a position to increase the number of copies of genes you and your close relatives do, or whatever models there are. Or we have a whole world of sort of animal cooperation built around kinship, and then we adopt a child from the other side of the planet and make a blended family. We absolutely break all the easy scientific models all the time.
And this raises a question about the word conscience, and another word, sincerity. What are these things? What is conscience? And what would be a science of conscience? What would that look like? How could we discover what conscience is, and that it, when it exists, and it doesn't even always exist in human beings, but when it does, it's something quite remarkable. It might also exist in an elephant. I actually believe it does. But what's going on here? You know, our question is, and I'm with you, I'm as kind of scientist, I mean, I'm critical mind, I'm looking for explanations and curiosity, with curiosity and wonder. What is this thing called sincerity? You know, let's say as a spiritual teacher, you have to know with your students which behaviors are real, or that is sincere, and which are just, say, manipulative. And sometimes they may look outwardly just the same, you know? People like to please the teacher, for instance. Well, will the teacher allow that, for instance? Put up with that? Or will you just, you know? And yet then the person who's sincere may be someone who's not even trying to please anybody. Those are the ones maybe have something special. So again, we're in this internal world of conscience, sincerity, qualities that arise within this human existence. Even for a scientist, you must know that there must be the same thing amongst the scientists, those who are sincerely looking for answers, honestly looking for answers, and not just defending their pet theories, right?
Yep. Or preparing their Swedish speech for Stockholm if they really hit a home run. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and scientists, as we know, these days, many scientists from different disciplines are trying to understand consciousness. There are many theories of consciousness, cognitive psychologists, neuroscientists, physicists, trying to understand what is consciousness, and mostly by, looking at the brain and neurons and something like that, to try to explain consciousness. But that seems to me arose from quantum theory, quantum mechanics, where the observer was so important for what we experience. That led the physicists to, at some point, question what is the observer, right? And then that led to what is consciousness. Now we have physicists trying to understand consciousness, and there are many theories, and I know many of them, and many of the scientists. And so it's an interesting thing, in that in this place here in Science and Non-Duality, we've had many conversations, I think, about theories of consciousness, and what is consciousness? And I remember, one of the panel, of scientists, I was asking them their explanation of consciousness and what is consciousness. And they all gave each one of them very interesting and cogent understanding of consciousness. But after we passed around, I said, well, all of that, to me, is what consciousness does, the function of consciousness. It doesn't say what consciousness is. And they all agreed by saying, you're right, because science doesn't explore ontology. We don't explore what is consciousness. We only explore the behavior of consciousness. And understandably, that's what science is. What is you observe? Like electron. We don't know what an electron is. I mean, Roger Penrose, one of the greatest scientists, he says, we don't know what an electron is. We know how it behaves. That's what we know about it. What is it, though? We don't know. And that's interesting, but science sort of beginning to recognize that. And Penrose actually says, not only that, in one of his main books, he says, actually, in our science, we don't know what matter is. Although it's explored through all, quarks and all of that, he said, we don't know what matter is. And that he said that it will take us several paradigm shifts before we understand what matter is. And then he said, it will take us several other paradigms before we understand what consciousness is. But there is a curiosity, which is an interesting thing. I mean, science explores the physical world, but fundamentally, the ones who really study what matter is, they say, we don't know what it is. What is it? You see, that's where the spiritual people differ a little bit than scientists. They explore things too. Spiritual people are researchers, but they research through their interiority, and they explore a lot of what is consciousness, what is matter, and I think one of the conundrum that is still spiritual people don't really know yet. Which is the same thing that the scientists don't know what is the relationship of consciousness to the physical, consciousness and the matter. What is the relationship of the two? Which is the same thing for spiritual people as the relationship between spirit and matter. They are related, they are entangled, but what is that relationship? It's a mystery, and it's a mystery on both sides, and I think it might be the thing that at some point will bring the two together in some kind of collaboration, because we're asking the same question.
The answer might be, when will we know what consciousness is?
Yeah.
The answer might be when consciousness tells us.
Yeah.
What's behind this statement is the idea that there is a kind of knowledge that is given, not attained.
Yeah.
Yes, there's knowledge that is attained through experiment, through our efforts, particularly in the material realm. Absolutely, science has been developing something. Developing its knowledge of physical laws and their application. But there's another dimension of knowing that is generally recognized among some of the greatest souls that have ever lived among humanity. That knowledge is something received. Knowledge of the universe comes in a revelatory fashion. And I'm not talking about people creating dogmas of religion, an experience of knowing that comes upon us. And this may be, the final knowing of what consciousness is. And maybe some people already know what that is and have that answer. I don't know. But I just wanted to make this comment that there is that, particularly, I know in my own spiritual tradition, the most important knowledge is something that is received. It's as if it comes from something higher and comes down, and then the human brain grasps it and has words for it, may have or may not have words for it in some cases. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, thank you. I feel maybe we move back to the human being a little bit, and I would like to use the opportunity that Robert is here, and you're the expert of stress. You have studied probably one of the most profound and your studies on stress and the human being. So can you speak a little bit more about what can we learn about the human condition by studying stress, and what happens to the human beings as our lives become more complex and more
or maybe I will say, what is a human about human?
What is?
What is a human about the human? What makes
human
the
about the
human be
human?
different? I mean, it's a primate, but we call them human. Why do we call them human?
As one example of that, and this is getting back to the notion of throw enough neurons into somebody's head and amazing things come out the other side. So it's been, about 20 years or so now that we've had the human genome sequenced. And about 10 years after that, people sequenced the chimp genome. And one of the most prevailing bits of dogma for decades have been that we share 98% of our DNA with chimps. And it turned out, once finally sequencing it, that was absolutely the case. It's about 98.5%, and about the same amount with bonobos. And this suddenly generated the greatest thing you can imagine, which is, what's the 1.5% difference? What are the genes that differ that make us human? And it's an incredibly disappointing list of genes. About half of the genes have to do with olfactory receptors. Basically, if you want to turn a chimp into a human, knock out about half of its olfactory acuity, and you're about halfway there to turning it into a human. Some of the other genes had to do with immune function. We get AIDS and they don't. They get terrible tuberculosis. It's slower in us. Things like that. A bunch about reproductive things. A bunch of genes had to do with body hair, explaining the guys who have lots of hair on their shoulders and how they're more chimpish than the rest of us. And you're sitting there and all you're looking for, where are the genes having to do with the brain? And there were virtually none. And the few that were found, all they have to do with is the number of rounds of cell division your neurons go through when you're a fetus. In other words, take a chimp brain and just have those neurons multiply themselves 2, 4, 8 more times, and out pops a human brain. The only difference is the sheer number of elements in there. So in terms of what is it that makes us human, that was a remarkably disappointing finding. And just multiply the brain, skew it a little bit more in the direction of the cortex than the rest of the brain, and you're going to get something that does sonnets coming out the other end, which is really remarkable. In terms of where stress fits into it, it's the same punchline. And in my talk earlier, I was emphasizing how much of our wiring, our physiology, our nuts and bolts are exactly the same as in every other species. And what's interesting about us is we go and activate it in totally unique realms. And stress is a great example of that. Our main stress hormone, cortisol, Structurally, it's virtually identical. Again, in fish and birds and reptiles, you've got some reptile who's stressing out another reptile by like bobbing its head in some territorial display, and its adrenal glands are secreting the exact same hormone that we do when we're thinking about like global warming. And the thing is that we do it for abstractions. We can be stressed about the fact that we're going to die someday. We can be stressed about children in refugee camps outside of Syria. We can be stressed thinking about what it was like for that casted outline of a human to have gone through the eruption of Pompeii. And 2,000 years later, you see the outlines of that individual sheltering their child when the pumice came down or whatever. And we can sit there and we can feel badly for a character in a novel. And we can feel empathy for, and we can hate somebody whose face we've never seen. And we can do all these abstractions, and we can mobilize the exact same physiology of love, hate, compassion, competition, aggression, empathy, etc., for pure ideas. I mean, we're willing to kill each other or die for symbols, for whether you were wearing the right color sneakers according to what gang you're in East LA, or whether your flag, this piece of cloth that has some pigments on it, you're willing to kill somebody over whether it's the opposing regiment or your side that's going to capture it, or you're willing to mow down 12 people in a satirical cartoonist's office in France over a cartoon. Our abstractions, chimps kill for territory. We kill for symbols, and that's just extraordinary, the abstraction. Chimps will, in some circumstances, die standing between a leopard and one of their loved ones. We will die for ideas and ideology and theology, and it's the same brain areas that are motivating you to do that, but it's the abstractions that make us who we are in those cases. So I think that's really the defining thing about us. For better or worse, we take remarkably ancient animal wiring and we extend it into just abstract domains that no chimp could ever make any sense of.
And it seems that the difference in DNA doesn't really account for it. It's more than the number of neurons. How much neurons, you have a lot more neurons, basically. That's what you're saying. That the complexity and the number of neurons is what's responsible for this new capacity, like abstraction.
Yep. Yeah. And the soundbite in the field that I love, that I said before, was with enough quantity, you invent quality.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One ant on a table makes no sense at all. And 10 ants make no sense, and put 100 of them there, and maybe they'll start making a trail to where you've left a breadcrumb, but put 10,000 of them together, and they make a colony, and they dig tunnels, and they maintain the temperature of the colony plus or minus 2 degrees, and they grow mushrooms, and they do all these, and no ant has a blueprint, and no ant, as part of 10,000, have any more complex rules than one ant does wandering around on a table. All it has is a half dozen rules as to how it interacts with whatever ant it bumps into, and put enough of them together and out comes something like that. And human brains are like that in a certain way.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would like to throw the hot question at you again. What do you think about transhumanism and AI? Do you subscribe to this notion that if we throw enough neurons and we will replicate the human being?
I think we will be lucky if we replicate a human being rather than something completely unrecognizable. My son is a senior at Stanford doing artificial intelligence, and this is his Oedipal revenge on me, that he could be incredibly contemptuous of neurons and how computationally primitive they are. So depending on that, he's far more knowledgeable than me. Depending on the day of the week, the computer power that is coming, the generalized artificial intelligence that's just down the road there. Best case scenario is him saying the first immortal human is already running around because they're just going to be uploaded into something. Worst case scenario, we're all going to be harvested for our carbon in about 20 years or so by the machines. Where we are somewhere on that continuum, I don't think anyone has a clue. And it's fairly scary when the most expert people out there haven't a clue.
Yes.
That's not necessarily a good sign.
It's very humbling to hear.
Yeah, that's really exciting if you're a painter. If you're a computer scientist, that strikes me as rather scary.
I wish I were better prepared on this subject, but there is some research coming out of Russia and also out of Oxford University that seems to indicate that DNA functions not purely on the physical level, but that DNA functions in relationship to the quantum field, to some non-local structures, and that the explanation of some of the things we're talking about may lie in that dimension. And as I said, I've read about this, I've heard a lecture on it. It was quite remarkable, but there amazing things are being discovered about DNA, some of them so extraordinary that to even speak of them, it sounds like hocus pocus, but in Russia, experiments have been duplicated where DNA has been created in a sterile beaker of water through transmission. That DNA appears in water. So DNA as a programming language of the universe is now beginning to appear as something that is like a messaging system. Does this ring any bells?
Absolutely, and as a measure of it, there's a whole world of terrifying molecular biologists who actually understand this stuff, who are now doing DNA computing, because they're the most, DNA is the most successful, stable, long-lasting informational storage means that the world has come up with so far, and absolutely building on that. And I understand it exactly as much as you do.
Or it's even postulated that DNA can be transmitted from the center of the galaxy to anywhere within the galaxy. Again, it's a programming language of the universe, and it's not explainable just by the physical laws that we're familiar with and which explain it to a certain extent. So anyway, this is another possible area. And there is an article in this week's Economist about using DNA to store information. I didn't understand it. I read it.
Probably because no one does.
Yeah, made no sense.
And we have discussed in length the dogma in spirituality, but I'm curious, what's your take on dogma in science? Where do you encounter in your work dogma?
Well, it's officially not a good thing. Like, if you're really doing the science business correctly, there's absolutely no thing that you ostensibly ascribe to that you should not be willing to jettison if somebody comes up with a convincing experiment that falsifies it. You know, that's the basic rules that we play by, and they're broken all the time because scientists are human. It's not because science is intrinsically subjective, but because science is done by subjective organisms with emotions and all that sort of thing. Wonderful examples of that are studies of, there's this historian of science, Frank Soloway, who's done these wonderful studies of looking at 400 years worth of scientific revolutions, and revolutions that were for real, whoa, the earth goes around the sun instead of the other way around, revolutions that were not for real, phrenology, predicting criminal behavior, things of that sort. But looking at all of the key scientific players in each one of these controversies and keeping track of who was a revolutionary who embraced this new movement and who was a rearguard conservative who said this can't be true, this can't be true. And looking at all sorts of personality traits of these scientists, being a firstborn son in these last 400 years is a very good predictor of being a conservative and going to your grave saying there can't be any such thing as like the plates of the planet moving around. Like every rearguard action of plate tectonics, geologists were like firstborn sons according to this guy's analysis. Even worse is being a firstborn son who thought your father was a swell guy. You are hopeless then. You are never going to embrace a new idea. But just a whole bunch of these predictors. In other words, dogma comes with a lot of emotional baggage. Max Planck, this famous physicist, said that science progresses one funeral at a time, which is exactly that idea of like, yeah, we're not supposed to be dogmatic, but we're humans. And what you see is as scientists get older, they're less and less not only open to inventing and discovering new amazing things, but they're less open to somebody else doing the same. They're more likely to become rearguard conservatives. There was a guy in grad school who was like one of the greatest cell biologists of the 20th century. And all this guy is ever going to be remembered for is he's the last major figure who insisted that DNA wasn't for real. Like he decided that as a 60-year-old and like spent the last 20 years of his career ruining the young careers of scientists coming up who were trying to study this DNA stuff that he didn't believe in. So, you know, there's lots and lots of that because, you know, as you get older, all the dogma does is when it's challenged, it means that you and your buddies are going to get kicked out of the textbooks. And that's like a very distressing thing for aging scientists. So yeah, dogma, officially a bad thing. We're all supposed to be officially stable and mature enough to be above it. You know, we're humans.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question, first of Hamid, but also of Robert. And the question is, given the extraordinary capacities of the human being to do the most amazing things, given the will and the motivation, what is most important or valuable for a human being to develop? And I'll tell a story. There was a king once who planned a contest in his kingdom, and he told his subjects, I'm going to give a price of so much gold to the person who can come up with the most amazing feat. So they gave everybody a year, and then the competition happened, and then the person who won the competition was a person who could thread the eye of a needle from across the room, like, you know. This was the most amazing thing developed within that kingdom that year. So the king said, all right, you win the prize, but off with your head, because for wasting your time on such a useless attainment. So I'm asking this question, of all the things that are developable in the human being, and I think all of us are concerned with development, education in a sense, human potential. What do you think is essentially valuable for a human being to develop? Or is this even the right question?
I think it's a good question. I mean, similar to, it takes me back to something I talked about last night, which is that we're lucky to be human. I said it, the way I said it to everybody, you've made it, you're human. Because human is a being that And it is because of the evolution and the many neurons we have and differences in DNA, all that science has shown human being to be slightly different from other. That makes what science can show, it leads to abstraction, all of that. But from a spiritual perspective, the human, because of the physical development, which is in some sense as more complete in some way than any other creatures on earth, which is different, which is, I think, is important and necessary, instead of thinking of it as a figment of our imagination or an illusion, that it is a real development that has happened, that is necessary for the further potential to arise. Not one of them is, of course, the abstraction that led to our science and scientific and industrial revolution, but the mind or consciousness has other possibilities, which is to recognize there are other domains of experience, other domains of action that are not visible physically, not visible mentally, not visible to most people, and requires a great deal of research, and which spiritual tradition call practice, to get to know, which is to see what does it mean to be a complete human being, not just a human being. So many spiritual traditions, one of them is a Sufi one, they talk about the perfect human being or the complete human being, which for them it means a human being that, because of the physical development and the completeness of the physical development, has the capacity now to be open to access other domain that makes the human being more complete, more what a human being is. Because what really makes what a human being is, from this kind of perspective, is what makes us more humane, what makes us appreciate beauty, what makes us love selflessly, but also what makes us be excited about discovery, what makes us be happy about having an insight. And that is the beginning of having insight, not just into our everyday life and scientific research, but insight about what we are as human beings. And the insight arises from new ranges of experience that are usually not available to most human beings, because the human being is the beginning of their development. So for spiritual tradition, the further evolution of the human being is more the evolution of the inner side, not the physical. The physical side maybe can develop further, we don't know, maybe it will evolve more, but with the present evolution of the physical body and the brain and nervous system, it makes possible. Now it is possible for us to access realms of experience that help us know what it means to be a mature human being, what it means to be a human being that can consider oneself and the other, the whole world, the whole universe, and see that we are custodians of not just humanity, but custodian of the whole universe. And that we are the custodian of the universe because we can know it. We are the children of the universe. And we are the children of the universe in a hologramic universe where each human being is the whole universe. And so I think what is most important, to answer your question, Kabir, is for us to be free for our potential to arise and to be actualized as completely as possible. and our potential is still not known, because we know we have more potential. We know some of the potential in terms of mental and scientific and all of that, but the spiritual potential also is part of that potential, what is called spiritual, which means the subjectivity brings in a range, like as you see a sunset, outside, it's beautiful. You can actually see something like a sunset within you. You could see something like a sunset, in fact, 1,000,000 times more beautiful, more magnificent than any sunset you can see. And you can see it within you, and you can realize that other human being can have that beauty. And that sunset is not just a sight, but it is also a feeling, a felt thing, a feeling of joy and a feeling of delight, a feeling of celebration and a feeling of, and that is part of the potential of the human, which is both a consciousness and a body that are, for the human, are more entangled, it seems, more connected than maybe other creatures that we know. And that is, I think, the promise, the opportunity of being human, that we can have that access, that have possibility. And for many traditions, they say that as more a maturation of a human being. In the sense that consciousness, not our body can mature, and we know our mind can mature, but the consciousness is an organism within an organism. It's an organism of consciousness that imbues the physical organism entangled with it, but can be experienced on its own as an organism, and this organism can evolve and develop and mature. So to have possibilities of creativity and experience and action, both inner and outer, that most people don't know, but can know by becoming more complete. So the most important thing is to be as complete in our potential, to actualize as much of it as possible. And it is a lot more than just, artistic creativity, scientific exploration. It is to see the wonder of reality and wonder of being a human being, which brings in also the values, a conscience that we never even dream, an inherent conscience, you see, that it makes it impossible for us to harm another being.
Yeah, thank you. Robert, do you have any reflection on the human potential? And I would like to take some questions from the audience afterwards.
I would just say that the most important human capacity to foster is the ability to take somebody else's perspective and to do that in a dispassionate way. Taking somebody else's perspective is a great way for conflict resolution. Taking somebody else's perspective is a great way for turning empathy into actual compassion, turning it into actually doing something rather than just feeling badly for them. Because the tendency in empathy is far too readily to think, oh my God, that's awful. What if that were happening to me? And all that happens when you do that is you were feeling a huge physiological need to turn away and decide why it really isn't your problem because it's oh too painful. Thinking instead, this is awful, what it must be like for them, and in a detached sort of way is instead much more of a predictor of people actually being able to act compassionately upon their empathy. So I would say sort of the most important thing is just training people to be able to have somebody else's perspective on what the world is like and what grievances they have and what they're afraid of and how did they get where they got to. That seems mighty important for the planet working better.
So if what you say is an important thing about the human being is to be able to take the perspective of others, why is it most scientists are not willing to take the perspective of spiritual people? I, as a spiritual person, I'm happy to take your perspective as a scientist, partly because I have been a scientist. But for some reason, scientists, most of them, are not willing to take the perspective of spiritual people who have been good, have done good to humanity, obviously loving and compassionate and gentle and all, but they're not willing to take their perspective for some reason. They don't want to put themselves in their shoes.
I think a big piece of it is tribalism and the guild that you belong to. And that's not, that's not the identity I have stamped on my forehead. Personally, I don't take a spiritualist perspective, but there isn't a day of the week where I don't wish that I could.
Mm-hmm. Maybe the day will come. Maybe not too far in the future. There's already an interaction happening here, we have empathy, right? We have mirror neurons, all of us do. So, and you can take our perspective, we can take your perspective. So maybe something already happening.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible gathering. This is a wonderful opportunity with Professor Sapolsky here and with our two wonderful spiritual teachers to ask a question which is all about where we are going as a humanity. And it has to do with what you so powerfully said, Dr. Sapolsky, about in our mammalian history, at least, we have this long, long notion of us versus them. Built into our DNA, if it's passed along like that certainly you've showed in primates, we can destroy the other. And we have this history of genocide. I don't know if rats do that, but certainly we do as primates. And then, so that's about 50 million years we've had this. And then in our human incarnation as primates, we've made an art of it, of taking our creative ways of destroying the other. You can even show in all sorts of brain scan studies that if you just have a sense that this person in front of you is an other, you stop the circuitry of empathy and compassion, full stop, and then you just treat the other person like an object rather than an entity with a mind or an inner experience. So given that, and given your expertise, and then given what the two of you are so powerfully asking us to do, which is to think about deeper issues about beauty and about love and about our interconnection, or in this conference, the whole idea of, at least my sense of it, of non-duality is realizing the interconnection of everything at that level. What we're doing in the Anthropocene era is really basically saying, well, as a species, we don't care about life on Earth. We just do things for commercial benefit or whatever. And if the UN report is right, if we don't turn things around, life on Earth will be profoundly different. So part of your question, Hamid, to Dr. Sapolsky is why can't we share each other's views, is you could argue that we need some kind of contemplative practices to get the capacity of the brain to change in response to training the mind so that we can overcome this process of us versus them and realize that it's not only about this bag of skin that we say, oh, you're different from me, or religions or ideas like you so powerfully talked about in your talk, Dr. Sapolsky, but it's about realizing that these species called life on Earth are all of us. So is there a way that from your scientific perspective and from your two spiritual perspectives, you can offer us some joining of these true, really important traditions? What do we know from science? What do we know from spiritual contemplative practice that could guide us in where the evolution of humanity and human consciousness and the human mind can go so we don't cook the planet? That's the question.
Well, right off the bat, I think that's a spectacularly important thing you've honed in on. I think the propensity towards dividing the world into us's and them's is deep, deep-seated. As I discussed earlier. You can even see it in a monkey, thinking about who reminds a monkey of a spider and who reminds them of a banana. Us-them is incredibly hardwired in us in deeply depressing ways. We process a them face in under 1/10 of a second. We are already doing that as 8-month-olds. It's remarkably entrenched to do this us-them dichotomizing. Two things seem hopeful with that. The first one is, at the same time, we're capable of doing remarkably atypical mammalian things when it comes to forming bridges of connectiveness. And the greatest example of that is that the average American pet has more money spent on their health care each year than is the case for the average human in the developing world. The sense of kinship we could feel for a different species is extraordinary. There was one study a few years ago showing that 46% of women would, if they had to make a choice, would save their dog rather than a foreign tourist from a bus hurtling out of control, in terms of us-themness there. And a more sort of hardcore endocrine version of it is there's this hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin has been around for about 60 million years. It's there for mother-infant bonding. It's there for the rare mammals that do pair bonding, monogamous pair bonding. It makes you more trusting. It makes you more emotionally expressive. It does all sorts of great stuff like that. And when you sit and you and your dog stare in each other's eyes, you both secrete oxytocin. And if the scientists boosts up your dog's oxytocin levels, your dog will stare at you longer and you will secrete more oxytocin. In the last 20,000 years, we've taken this 60 million year old hormone and used it for affiliation into, forget another primate, this is like a distant species from us. So we have this extraordinary capacity or potential for that. Amid the forcefulness with which we us-them, the automaticity, the innateness, the implicitness of it, the one thing I take comfort from is it's incredibly easy to manipulate a human as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And you could change those categorizations within a second. One of the most depressing findings in that whole literature is you stick somebody in a brain scanner and you're flashing up faces for 1/10 of a second, and in your average human, you flash up the face of somebody of a different race and you get activation of the amygdala, a part of the brain having to do with fear and aggression and anxiety. This is incredibly depressing. This has been replicated over and over, and now you do the experiment slightly differently. Get the right sort of person in that brain scanner, and now you're flashing up and each face is wearing a baseball cap, either with the logo of the home team or the rival team. And if the person in the scanner is the right sort of sports fanatic, their amygdala activates now for the other sports team. It doesn't track any other feature. In other words, within a second, you could unwire supposedly, this long-lasting, humans have evolved different racial categories and it's innate and it's implicit in 1/10 of a second. And I don't know what millennium baseball was invented in, but it's fairly recent, and that could trump that in 1/10 of a second. In other words, it may be, as a pessimistic finding, that we inevitably break the world into us's and thems, but it's really easy to get us to have far more inclusive us categories and far more benign ways of dividing the world. And if it comes down to we need to view the world as all of us against the house of Slytherin or something, that may be the solution we have to reach. I think there's some grounds for optimism there.
I think the poison and the remedy is within ourselves. And while all this is true, the us and them syndrome, what's also remarkable is that there is something about human beings that when we come to know another, come to know the enemy, the other race, the other religion, that the us and them can dissolve. And that's an extraordinary fact.
Yep.
That's where the hope lies. Our othering is so much about not knowing the other. There's a story in my tradition where Ali, who is the close companion of Muhammad, son-in-law, was walking down the street with another friend of his, and he gives a nice wave and smile to somebody who's passing by. And then Ali's friend says, "Don't you know that that guy hates you? Why did you give him that big hello?" And Ali just said, "He doesn't know. He doesn't hate me. He doesn't know me."
Yeah.
I think, in response to that question, that if we...
I think we lost your microphone. 1 second.
Is it okay? Is it coming through? Or should I use this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lost my voice. Is that if we only looking at our physiology, it is hardwired, the us and them. And so like in our school, for instance, our spiritual school, there is this whole movement about diversity and inclusivity. And people think we just need to do a little few things to include more races, more. And I keep telling them, it's not that easy. It's hardwired. We have to overcome something profound. It's not a matter of just, it is partly knowing each other. If you go to school with different races, it helps. But it is really our spiritual nature, I think, is the hope. Because our spiritual nature, we realize in it, it is the nature of everybody. Although we are different, there is us and them. But if you know the spiritual nature, you see the spiritual nature of them is the same as my spiritual nature. And it's not, it is similar, it is the same one. So the them is really me. From a spiritual perspective, there's no us and them. The us and them exists only as biologically, as just all primates have it. And we are some of the primates. So if you depend on that, there is some hope, but it is not really sufficient to really make it possible without the inclusion of spirit. And I'm hoping that that will develop, that more people will know the spiritual nature, because the more we know the spiritual nature, we know the other without even meeting them. We know them because we know their nature, we know their spirit, because it is our spirit. Everybody is me, and I am is everybody. So they are included inherently when we know the spiritual nature. And that is the value of the mature human being, because the mature human being is both physical and spiritual at the same time, entangled totally. So it uses all the evolution and the capacity, neuronal capacity that we have, but it uses that to bring in the other side of the human being, which the true presence of consciousness, the true spirit, which has vast riches of love and compassion and infinite compassion, infinite love, and infinite sensitivity and potentialities of all kind to know the other at a distance without meeting them. Like I can know a human being by knowing their nature, because I am the same nature, but I can know them individually without meeting them. That is a spiritual capacity that, if we stay with the biological and scientific, we don't know that exists. But spiritual people have known it for thousands of years. And I think of that, this is, if everything fails, that's the fail-safe mechanism we have, that we are fundamentally spiritual being. I myself, my experience, and for decades, I'm more spiritual than physical. This physical is a facet of what I am, and a small facet. I am mostly something vast, something multifaceted, something amazing and miraculous. And the physical, I need it. It is part of me. I love it, and I need it. And It is the way I live in this world, but I am much more than my neurons. My neurons are my gateway to operate in this world, so I can bring the riches of what it means to be a human being and interaction with other human beings. And I just hope that, and I think even if about the AI, the one thing about AI, I think AI will develop, it's bound to develop, and will supersede human being in terms of power because they're faster. I mean, they're not more intelligent. They're just, the speed make them more intelligent. It's not organic intelligence. It is speed of computation. So they will surpass human being. But AI will never have a subjective experience. They want, about the qualia of consciousness. Can any computer have a qualia? Can any computerize any digital device know its subjective experience? Can experience love not as a response to something, but as love in itself? So the qualia of consciousness is neuroscientists exploring it. Many neuroscientists trying to answer, where does the qualia come from? And I tried to talk to one of the neurologists. I said, I can't help. He didn't want to listen to me. Why? Because he knows I'm going to come from spiritual dimension, not from but I thought I could really help him. He doesn't have to take the spiritual. I could give him some insight that can help his research, but he wasn't willing to do it. But there might be people who will be willing to do it. So anyway, I think the AI will develop, but they will never be able to have the experience that human being can have, which is how we can be the qualia of our consciousness, and the consciousness itself, that is conscious of itself. I mean, a computer can know itself only as a response to stimulus. But that's not the way consciousness knows itself. It knows itself by being itself, but that takes us to a whole thing.
Thank you, Hamid. Thank you. And unfortunately, we run out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for this rich conversation and for your patience and openness to be in this. And thank you.